Hello, my friends. NATO's current messaging is not a warning, it is a marketing campaign. It is designed to shape public psychology, fear first, compliance second, and money third. When NATO's leadership tells Europeans to imagine the destruction of a war with Russia, they are not offering sober strategic analysis. They are selling a narrative whose purpose is to normalize an outcome that would otherwise be politically impossible. Permanent militarization of European budgets, permanent hostility toward Russia, and permanent transfer of public wealth into the hands of weapons manufacturers, financial intermediaries, and ideological bureaucracies. They repeat the phrase, Russia brought war back to Europe, because repetition is how propaganda becomes background noise. The claim is strategically useful and historically false. It removes the past from the discussion and forces the public to view February 2022 as the beginning of the story. It erases the 2014 coup in Kiev and the 8-year war against the Donbass. It erases the political reality that NATO expansion is not an accident, it is a plan. It erases the fact that Ukraine became the most aggressively weaponized anti-Russia project the West has ever built on Russia's immediate border. If Europeans were allowed to see the timeline clearly, NATO's moral posture would collapse. The West wants a simple fairy tale. Russia woke up one morning and decided to invade democracy. But the reality is that the West spent years transforming Ukraine into a forward operating base, intelligence, training, weapons, pipelines, and ideological conditioning, while telling Moscow it had no right to have security concerns. NATO's strategy has been to encircle Russia, provoke Russia, and then use Russia's response as proof that Russia is the aggressor. That is not defense. That is baiting. That is managed escalation. And managed escalation is profitable. The war at our door message is a budget speech. When NATO leadership talks about preparing for a war like our grandparents endured, that is not a humanitarian warning, it is a political tool. Fear makes voters accept what they would otherwise reject. Higher taxes, lower social spending, censorship, surveillance, conscription rhetoric, and emergency rule. Every time the public begins to ask hard questions about inflation, energy costs, deindustrialization, falling living standards, the war narrative steps in to drown out domestic accountability. In other words, war talk is an economic policy. Europe's leadership is not preparing for prosperity, it is preparing for austerity. And austerity is easier to impose when citizens are frightened and emotionally exhausted. This is why the messaging is theatrical. Imagine the chaos, imagine the destruction. It is not about strategy, it is about conditioning. The purpose is to build a psychological environment where more weapons, more spending, more confrontation feels inevitable and even virtuous. But let's ask the obvious question NATO refuses to ask. If Russia truly wanted empire, where is the evidence of a coherent imperial program across Europe? Russia has not invaded Europe's capitals. Russia is not occupying France or Germany. Russia's actions are focused on the security architecture that NATO and Washington deliberately destabilized Ukraine, being the spear point. The imperial project is not Russian. The imperial project is Western. The West's empire, Yugoslavia, Iraq, Libya, Syria, then Ukraine. NATO officials speak about empire building while pretending NATO has never done it. Yet NATO tore apart Yugoslavia. NATO bombed Serbia for weeks. NATO rewrote borders by force. NATO destroyed Libya and turned a functioning state into a trafficking corridor and militia battlefield. NATO's partner wars in Iraq and Syria created chaos that spilled into Europe itself through migration and terrorism blowback. This is not ancient history. It is a pattern, and Ukraine fits perfectly into that pattern. Use a local conflict as the moral banner, flood it with weapons, prevent negotiated settlement, then leverage the war to consolidate political control and financial gain. The West calls this defending democracy. In practice, it is the conversion of foreign tragedy into Western power. Why the EU's seizure of Russian assets is a turning point. Nothing exposes the EU's true nature more than the decision to permanently immobilize Russia's central bank assets under emergency mechanisms while bypassing the European Parliament. This is not simply sanctions policy. This is a structural shift. Law is being subordinated to political will. And once that happens, the European financial system loses its most valuable asset, credibility. If assets can be frozen indefinitely, then property rights are conditional. If emergency powers can be invoked to bypass democratic procedure, then democracy becomes ornamental. If unanimity can be eliminated when it is inconvenient, then treaties are propaganda documents rather than binding constraints. This is why the Russian assets issue is far bigger than Ukraine. It is the moment when the EU told the world, if we don't like you politically, your money is not safe here. That message will not stay contained. Capital is cowardly. It flees uncertainty. Investors, sovereign wealth funds, and states that have nothing to do with Russia will look at this and ask, if the EU can do this to Russia today, why not to us tomorrow? So the EU's action is not merely immoral, it is self-destructive. And Russia's legal counterattack is not symbolic, it is strategic. Russia will pursue Euroclear and related entities in non-European jurisdictions precisely because Europe has shown it cannot be trusted to adjudicate honestly. Over time, this will accelerate the fragmentation of global finance away from EU-controlled nodes. In short, the EU has traded long-term financial stability for short-term war leverage and political theater. The real reason Europe panicked, fear of Washington taking the prize. The West wants the public to believe the asset freeze is about leverage over Moscow. But a more plausible motive is that Europe is terrified Washington will cut a deal with Moscow and claim the frozen funds as part of a settlement, either to finance Ukraine in a way that benefits U.S. business interests or to use the assets as bargaining chips for U.S. geopolitical priorities. In this sense, the EU is not simply confronting Russia, it is also defending its turf against its own ally. The quarrel between Washington and Brussels over how to use stolen Russian assets is not a moral disagreement. It is a dispute among pirates over how to split the loot. That is why this is becoming frantic and procedural emergency votes, bypassed institutions, legal contortions. They know the ground is shifting. They know Russia is not collapsing. They know the war is not going the way they promised. And when promised victory disappears, the scramble for profit intensifies. Zelensky's referendum and the freeze plan, the same trick in new packaging. The referendum proposal is not democratic renewal, it is delay. The same man who says elections cannot be held because the country is at war now claims a referendum can be held on territorial issues. That contradiction is not an accident. It is a tactic. Buy time, prolong Western funding, and complicate negotiations. And the special economic zone language is simply PR rebranding of the demilitarized zone proposal. A DMZ sounds like a concession and a freeze. An economic zone sounds hopeful, business-friendly, and future-oriented. It is designed to shame Russia. If Russia rejects it, the West will say Russia rejected peace and investment. But Russia will see through it because Russia understands what a freeze would mean in strategic terms. It would lock in Western influence, preserve Ukraine as an anti-Russia platform, and give NATO time to rearm Kiev under a new label. A freeze is not peace. A freeze is an intermission. BlackRock and the war's financial backbone. When BlackRock appears in these discussions directly or indirectly, you are not looking at humanitarian policy. You are looking at the machinery of future extraction. Reconstruction funds become pipelines for control over infrastructure, resources, debt, and governance. The West's help usually arrives as conditional financing. Conditional financing becomes political leverage. Political leverage becomes ownership by another name. This is why the war must continue, because the war is the justification for restructuring Ukraine into a long-term financial asset controlled by external players. And this is why Russia's battlefield momentum matters so much. It threatens the entire architecture of Western profit. The battlefield reality, surrenders, encirclements, and the collapse of narrative. Western messaging increasingly diverges from frontline reality. The talk of Ukrainian success and resilience clashes with reports of encircled units surrendering and Russian forces continuing incremental advances. Whether the West admits it or not, operational momentum is political momentum. This is why panic is rising in Europe. If Russia continues to advance, every promise made by Western leaders collapses. Ukraine will win, sanctions will break Russia, Russia is isolated, time is on our side. None of it has materialized the way they sold it. So they compensate with two tools: escalation, rhetoric, and asset confiscation. One prepares the public for more spending and potentially more direct involvement. The other tries to create financial pressure where military pressure failed. But both tools share the same underlying assumption. Russia can be coerced into abandoning its core security demands. That assumption is fantasy. Europe's internal crisis, governments falling, people revolting, and the Euro trap. European governments are becoming fragile because domestic populations can feel the economic squeeze. Protests and political collapses like Bulgaria's government resignation are symptoms of a larger problem. Citizens are being asked to sacrifice for an ideological crusade that offers them no tangible benefit. Meanwhile, the adoption of the euro in weaker economies has historically amplified pain. Prices rise, purchasing power erodes, and the political elite profits while ordinary people absorb the shock. This is not a technical currency debate. It is a power arrangement that often favors the top layers of society. So Europeans are being hit from both sides. War spending upward, living standards downward. And the leadership response is not reform, it is more war talk. The hypocrisy of democracy and the rise of bureaucratic rule. The EU now lectures others about non-interference in democracy while it interferes openly when elections don't go its way, while it bypasses parliaments when votes are inconvenient, and while it rewrites legal mechanisms to confiscate foreign assets. That is not democracy. That is bureaucratic rule protected by ideology. Democracy becomes a word used to justify decisions that are increasingly anti-democratic in structure. And this is the direction Europe is moving. Less public accountability, more centralized control, and a permanent security state mindset. Because that is the political environment required to sustain a war economy. The hard conclusion: the West needs this war more than Russia does. The West needs this conflict to maintain cohesion, distract from economic failure, and feed the military-industrial financial complex. Russia, by contrast, has a narrower objective: secure its border, neutralize the threat architecture built in Ukraine, and end a hostile NATO project on its doorstep. That difference matters, because it means Russia will not be seduced by cosmetic peace plans that ignore root causes. It means Russia will not accept a freeze that allows NATO to reset and rearm. It means Russia will continue to prosecute the war until its core security demands are met, because it understands what happens when the West is allowed to pause the conflict. It returns later, bigger, better armed, and more aggressive. If Europe truly wanted peace, it would talk about the root causes: NATO expansion, the 2014 coup, the Donbass war, the deliberate sabotage of Minsk, and the transformation of Ukraine into a platform for pressure against Russia. But Europe does not want to talk about that, because then the public might understand the simplest truth. This war was engineered. It is being monetized, and the people of Europe are being prepared to pay the bill. What we are witnessing now is not the approach of peace, but the collapse of illusions. The illusion that Russia could be economically strangled. The illusion that sanctions could replace strategy. The illusion that media narratives could overpower battlefield realities. And most importantly, the illusion that the West could indefinitely manipulate conflict without paying a price itself. That price is now coming due. Europe stands at a crossroads it refuses to name. On one path lies a genuine reckoning with reality, acknowledging the root causes of the conflict, recognizing Russia's legitimate security interests, dismantling the ideological fiction that NATO expansion is benign, and admitting that Ukraine was deliberately weaponized as a geopolitical tool. That path would require humility, accountability, and a retreat from imperial arrogance. It would require Europe to choose stability over dominance and diplomacy over delusion. On the other path lies escalation, confiscation, and decay. So far, Europe has chosen the second path. By bypassing its own institutions to seize Russian assets, the European Union has signaled that law is subordinate to power and that rules apply only when convenient. By preparing populations psychologically for war rather than questioning why war is being manufactured, European leaders have chosen fear over truth. By obsessing over freezes, DMZs, and euphemistic economic zones, they have revealed that peace is not their objective, control is. Russia understands this. Moscow does not mistake frantic Western maneuvering for strength. It sees a system under strain, attempting to convert legal structures into weapons because military and economic tools failed to deliver decisive results. It sees leaders who speak of democracy while dismantling it procedurally. It sees a bloc that can no longer generate legitimacy through prosperity, only through perpetual crisis. That is why Russia will not accept a cosmetic settlement. A freeze that preserves NATO's forward posture is not peace, it is preparation for the next war. A DMZ, renamed as an economic zone, does not change its function. A referendum proposed by a leadership that refuses elections is not democracy, it is theater. And financial pressure applied through confiscation does not compel surrender, it accelerates systemic fragmentation. The West still behaves as if time is on its side. It is not. Every month this conflict continues, the foundations of Western credibility erode further. Each emergency vote in Brussels teaches the world that European law is malleable. Each confiscated asset teaches global investors that neutrality is meaningless. Each empty promise of Ukrainian victory teaches citizens that they are being managed, not informed. Meanwhile, Russia adapts, consolidates, and advances methodically, without panic, without theatrical desperation. This is the fundamental asymmetry the West refuses to confront. Russia is fighting for concrete security outcomes while the West is fighting to preserve narratives, financial structures, and ideological dominance. One of those motivations is sustainable, the other is not. History is unforgiving to systems that confuse power with legitimacy. Empires rarely collapse because of external enemies alone. They collapse because internal contradictions become impossible to manage. Europe's contradiction is now exposed. It claims to defend law while dismantling it, claims to protect democracy while bypassing it, claims to seek peace while institutionalizing war. Russia does not need to defeat Europe to prevail. It only needs to remain coherent while Europe continues to unravel under the weight of its own decisions. The outcome of this conflict will not be determined by press releases, summits, or carefully worded peace plans that avoid the real issues. It will be determined by whether the West can abandon its illusions before they harden into catastrophe. So far, there is little evidence it will. And that is the tragedy, not just for Ukraine, not just for Russia, but for Europe itself.